The WNBA's 30th season opened with viewership numbers that, by any measure, were historic. A preseason game between the New York Liberty and the Indiana Fever drew an average audience of 743,000 viewers on the ION network, with peak viewership approaching 1 million. For context, this was a preseason game, not a playoff matchup, not a finals appearance. It was the most watched preseason broadcast in the network's history of carrying the league, and it arrived before the regular season had even begun. Those numbers reflected something that has been building for several years. The conversation around women's professional basketball has shifted. Television contracts worth billions of dollars have been signed. Expansion franchises are entering markets that did not previously have a professional team. Salary structures have been renegotiated from the ground up. The infrastructure of the league, its media presence, its commercial relationships, its player compensation, has been reorganized in ways that would have seemed unlikely even 5 years ago. But on the evening of that record-breaking preseason broadcast, something else happened. Midway through the fourth quarter, the feed went dark for a significant portion of the viewing audience. A graphic appeared indicating the game had concluded. The players were still on the court. Viewers who switched to the official application found it unresponsive. Those watching through affiliated streaming services encountered similar failures. Posts across social media documented the outage in real time, with fans reporting that the disruption lasted long enough to miss a meaningful portion of live game action. The league's digital infrastructure, confronted with an audience it had been working for years to attract, was unable to sustain the load. The failure was not incidental. It illustrated, in a concrete and public way, the gap between the scale of the league's commercial ambitions and the technical capacity it currently operates with. A broadcast that should have served as confirmation of the league's growing prominence instead became the most visible evidence of an institutional readiness problem. The timing matters. The WNBA is in the middle of negotiating its identity as a major sports property. Billion-dollar media rights agreements have been signed. New ownership groups have entered the league at valuations that reflect serious capital investment. The expectation on the part of those investors and the networks that have committed to carrying games is that the product being delivered, both on the court and through the various distribution channels, will meet the standards of a major professional league. The preseason broadcast did not meet that standard. For the fans who encountered the outage, the experience carried a particular frustration. Many of them are relatively new to following the league. They arrived because of the heightened coverage, the expanded broadcast footprint, and the quality of play they had seen highlighted across media platforms. A broadcast failure on the first major game of the season is not an abstract operational problem for that audience. It is the product they encountered, and it is the product they will remember when deciding whether to return. The outage also intersected with a distribution structure that, independent of technical failures, has made consistent viewership difficult for a significant portion of the audience. Preseason games in several markets were inaccessible to fans without specific cable packages or secondary streaming subscriptions. In some cases, fans living within a few miles of their home team's arena were unable to watch the game through any available legal channel. These are not edge cases. They reflect the terms of the media rights agreements that govern where and how games are distributed, and they create friction at precisely the moment when the league most needs to make consumption easy. But the structure of how sports rights are sold and distributed is not unique to the WNBA. Fragmented access, blackout policies, and subscription-based streaming have become standard features of professional sports broadcasting across all major leagues. But the problem carries a different weight for a league that is still working to convert casual interest into sustained viewership habits. For a fan base that the league characterizes as relatively new and still forming its relationship with the product, every instance of blocked access is a point at which that relationship can fail to develop. The league's commercial partners benefit from the rights fees they have paid. Whether those arrangements ultimately serve the interests of audience growth is a separate question. The Indiana Fever entered the preseason without 3 players who were expected to be significant contributors. Aaliyah Boston, Ty Harris, and Lexi Hull were listed as inactive, with the team describing the absences as precautionary. No additional detail was provided. The vagueness of that characterization drew immediate attention from fans familiar with the franchise's handling of injury information during the previous season. In 2025, the Fever managed the medical status of their most prominent player with a level of opacity that generated sustained criticism. What was initially described as minor soreness was eventually disclosed as a bone bruise in the ankle, an injury that affected Caitlin Clark's availability and performance across a meaningful stretch of the season. The information was released in portions, often trailing rather than preceding public speculation, and rarely with enough specificity for fans or media to assess the actual severity of the situation. The question that the previous season raised, and that the current preseason has returned to, is whether the Fever's communication practices around player health reflect a deliberate policy, and if so, what that policy is intended to protect. Other organizations in the league provide varying levels of injury detail, and the degree of disclosure varies across teams, but the Fever's pattern has been notable enough that the comparison is now a standing reference point. Fans have begun tracking whether other teams provide more complete information under similar circumstances, and the answer, in many instances, appears to be yes. The concern is not abstract. Caitlin Clark is the most commercially significant player in the league's current moment. Her availability directly affects broadcast ratings, arena attendance, merchandise sales, and the broader marketing investments that sponsors have made in the league based on projected audience reach. If she is injured, that information is material, not only to fans managing their expectations, but to every stakeholder who has made a financial commitment based on assumptions about her participation. The Fever have, according to reporting, made changes to their medical and performance staff in the offseason. The organization has described a more systematic approach to player health management, with an emphasis on load monitoring and injury prevention. Those changes may result in better outcomes, but the communication practices that surround how health information is shared publicly are a separate matter, and there has been no corresponding announcement of any change in that area until the players described as precautionary absences return to the court in full practice activity. The questions from the previous season remain active. The Phoenix Mercury will be without Kat Westbeld for the 2026 season. She suffered a torn anterior cruciate ligament while competing overseas during the offseason, and will not be available when the season begins. The loss is significant for a Mercury roster that relied on her as a primary contributor last year, and it arrives before the franchise has had any opportunity to assess its competitive position in a season defined by substantial changes across the league. Westbeld's injury is not an isolated case. Napheesa Collier, one of the most accomplished players in the league, will also miss the beginning of the season following surgery for an injury she sustained during the offseason. The pattern, competitive losses sustained in activity that takes place outside the WNBA schedule, is one that the league and its players have confronted for years without arriving at a durable resolution. The underlying economics are not complicated. For most of the league's existence, WNBA salaries have not been sufficient to allow players to remain financially stable without supplementing their income through overseas play. Players who have competed at the Olympic level, won championship rings, and accumulated multiple All-Star selections have, in many cases, earned less from their WNBA contracts than the cost of a modest apartment in the markets where they played. The overseas leagues, primarily in Europe and Australia, have paid significantly more, with additional benefits including housing and transportation. For players without independent wealth or substantial endorsement income, declining to play overseas was not a realistic choice. The new collective bargaining agreement has begun to change those conditions. The team's salary cap has increased from approximately $1.5 million to $7 million. The maximum individual player salary has risen to $1.4 million under a supermax structure. For a player at the top of the market, the economic calculus is shifting. Remaining in the United States for an extended offseason is now a financially viable option in a way that it was not previously. But the transition is not immediate, and the players who are currently sustaining injuries overseas are largely not the same players who will be the first beneficiaries of the new salary structure. The gap between when the policy changes and when the economic effects reach every player in the league is a period of continued exposure. Organizations are beginning to include provisions in contracts that address overseas activity, with some teams placing restrictions or incentive structures around off-season participation. The new collective bargaining agreement provides a framework for those conversations. The injuries being reported now are products of the conditions that preceded it. The Unrivaled League, a 3-on-3 domestic competition developed partly as an alternative to overseas play, was designed in part to address this problem. By providing competitive, high-visibility activity during the WNBA offseason within the United States, it offered players an option that carried lower logistical burden and in theory, lower injury risk than travel to European leagues in winter conditions. The league completed its second season, and by most audience measures it has performed well, but players have sustained injuries during unrivaled competition as well. Aaliyah Boston's current precautionary absence from fever practice has been connected to activity during the unrivaled playoffs. The competition is physically demanding by design, and game speed activity at any level carries inherent risk. Unrivaled has reduced, but not eliminated, the exposure that players face in the months between WNBA seasons. The salary cap increase is restructuring how franchises approach roster construction in ways that will take more than one season to fully understand. The Indiana Fever are among the teams most directly affected. Under the previous structure, the roster decisions they made were constrained by a cap that limited their ability to pay even their most important players at market rates. Under the new structure, they are managing cap space with an explicit awareness that Caitlin Clark will be eligible for a maximum contract in the near term. Clark finished last season as a first-team All-WNBA selection. A strong 2026 campaign, particularly one that includes an MVP award, would position her as a candidate for the Supermax contract. The Fever's roster decisions this offseason, including the departures of several role players, reflect a front office that is managing its salary sheet with that possibility in mind. Teams that enter a Supermax negotiation without available cap space are in a materially weaker position than those who have preserved it. The league-wide implications of the new salary structure are still being worked out. Players who have spent careers in the league under the previous compensation framework are now operating in an environment where the gap between the highest-paid players and the rest of the roster is significantly larger than it was. The Supermax is not a structure that benefits every player equally. It concentrates financial resources at the top of the market, while the majority of players negotiate contracts within a range that, while improved, remains a fraction of what comparable talent would earn in other professional leagues. The transition to higher pay is real. Its distribution across the full player pool is uneven. Angel Reese is no longer a member of the Chicago Sky. On April 6, the Sky traded her to the Atlanta Dream in a transaction that altered the competitive balance of the Eastern Conference before the regular season began. The trade involved the exchange of roster assets between the two franchises, with Atlanta acquiring Reese as the centerpiece of the deal. Reese was, by most measures, one of the league's most productive players during her time in Chicago. Her rebounding numbers were elite, and she established herself as one of the defining interior presences in the game over the course of her first two seasons. The trade generated significant attention because of both her profile and the circumstances surrounding her departure from a team she had been identified with since entering the league. What has drawn attention in the preseason footage that has emerged from Atlanta is not the trade itself, but the way Reese is being used. The clips circulating show her operating at or near the three-point line at a frequency that was not a feature of her game in Chicago. She is being used as a ball handler in transition, as a perimeter initiator, and in situations that require her to create offense away from the paint rather than within it. The adjustment represents a significant expansion of her role, and it is visible enough in the available preseason material that it has become a point of discussion among people who cover the league. Whether the change reflects a deliberate development decision made during the offseason, an adaptation to the personnel and scheme of the new coaching staff, or some combination of both, is not yet clear from public information. What is evident is that the player returning to Chicago for the first time in an opposing uniform is playing differently than the one who left. Her reception in that building and her performance over the course of the season will be among the more closely watched narratives in the Eastern Conference. The league's expansion is proceeding on the schedule that has been announced. The Golden State Valkyries are entering competition with Portland and Toronto franchises in development behind them. Each new franchise represents an expansion of the league's geographic footprint, a new market for broadcast rights and commercial partnerships, and additional roster spots in a league that has historically operated with a fixed and limited number of available positions. The concern being expressed within front offices and among player development professionals is about the ratio of available talent to available roster spots. The league has operated for its entire history with 144 roster spots, 12 players per team across 12 franchises. That number is increasing as franchises are added. The pool of players who can compete at the WNBA level has not expanded at the same rate. The WNBA has positioned itself as the highest standard in women's professional basketball, defined in part by the selectivity of its rosters. The argument for that position has rested on the limited number of available spots and the quality of the competition for those spots. As the league adds franchises, the teams filling out their rosters are drawing from a pool that has not grown proportionally. The consequence is that some roster positions are being filled by players who would not have been competitive for a spot in the previous structure. Whether that represents a meaningful dilution of the product on the floor, or whether the talent development pipeline will expand to meet the demand, depends on factors that will take several seasons to evaluate. The charter travel arrangement that the players secured through extended negotiations has been, by the accounts available, inconsistently implemented. The agreement represented a concrete improvement over the commercial flight arrangements that players were required to use for most of the league's history. Players had argued for years that commercial travel created competitive disadvantages, recovery time, scheduling exposure, and the physical toll of navigating commercial airports with equipment that their counterparts in the NBA did not face. The charter arrangement was presented as a resolution to those concerns.